As we begin to study the Bible and really focusing on the Old Testament, one of the bigger questions we're faced with is there a centralized theme or really a main focal point that God is really teaching us through the Scriptures? Now, as I've gone through this study and I've gone back and forth between some of the other themes that are clearly present, it's the theme of kingdom that seemingly stands out above all the rest. So I want to show you that as it develops through the Old Testament study. Now we begin at the very beginning in the book of Genesis. We see that God intently creates mankind and places him in the Garden of Eden. Now this is really the first instance where kingdom itself shows to be a focal point in God's eyes and in God's plan. The Garden of Eden was this beautiful place of perfection. And we see here in Genesis 1, verses 26 through 28, that God's intent for mankind, his creation, was to rule in that kingdom. It says, "And then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky." So we see here that God blesses them. And then God says to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So here we see the first instance of God's intent for kingdom growth, kingdom advancement. Now, we know how the story goes, and we know that mankind fell victim to sin. And really it was mankind's choosing to take over in sin nature. So what took place? Well, it was a separating of man from perfection, from man in that relationship with God. So the separating force creates this hardship, and really one might say, well, this is where the theme of salvation comes in. And you're absolutely right that there is a need for salvation, which is why that is a main or sub-theme to the biblical study. But I believe that to be more of a building block in the kingdom. See, yes, God saves his people. And we see this played out specifically in the New Testament. But for what purpose would he save them? And to me, that's where kingdom takes reign. It's where kingdom is really the leading factor in what God is teaching us here. Because everything that God suggests is because of his desire to see kingdom growth. So we see this again in Genesis 3, verse 15. And that's where we see this introduction of the end focal point, the end reasoning for kingdom. And that is, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel." So while sin has certainly captured humanity, we see that God has already put into plan the saving factor that will restore that relationship with him and his kingdom. Now, it's here in Genesis 4 through 11 that we see the two lineages of man and how it plays out. We see the line of human development, which is an ungodly line. And it's a line that dwells in this realm of sin. But then we see this other line, which is more of a godly line. And it's this line that leads us to Abraham. Now, with Abraham, we see three different things play into the Abrahamic covenant, which is that God will make the descendants of Abraham into a great nation. And in that, he will also bless them with the land to dwell in. And in this, they will establish a special relationship with God. So we see here that God is providing for his people. He's providing them a place to live, to dwell in, and really an opportunity to multiply in this great kingdom that he has created. Now again, we see that the story of sin plays its effect, and we see that this sin leads to further judgment of God. And some might say, well, God is just a judgmental God. Yes, God is a just God, and what we know is he must punish sin. But he's also a God of love, and we see this played out through the minor prophets. One of my favorite being the prophet Hosea, who depicts this beautiful relationship. So It's not only a beautiful relationship at first glance, he depicts a relationship between him and an unfaithful wife. And really, it's a bride who is an adulteress, committing scandalous acts against Hosea. And Hosea this whole time knows that she is going to be unfaithful to him. So through a series of unfaithful events that lead to children who are not Hosea's, we see that eventually Gomer leaves Hosea. But what we see is that Hosea pursues after her, paying a hefty cost to get her back, all to be in a relationship, all to be hopeful of a future that will come. And really what we see here is the message that God is sending to us, his people, that he, like Hosea, will pursue after us and gives us the hope of a restored relationship. Now we see this in the writings as well. We see this in the other prophets, but we see this continual story about how mankind is deviating from God's desire to be in a relationship with him, God's desire to see his kingdom grow. And so what we see is that this is restored. We see this in the covenant Psalms. We see this in David and the Davidic covenant, where God's saying, through the line of David, I will restore my people to their right ruler. And it's through this line that I will bring the everlasting hope that I have promised my people. It'll be through this line that my kingdom and my desired kingdom will come to fruition. Because see, we look at the here and now and say, well, has God's promise in these covenants been fulfilled? But really, it was in the new kingdom at that point that we see, or the New Testament, that we see this new kingdom come about. And we know that this new kingdom is the Messiah, Jesus Christ himself, who is the sacrificial atonement. And it's through this sacrifice on the cross that the hope of the kingdom is restored. So that anyone who would believe in him, like John 3:16 says, for whoever shall believe in him shall not perish but have life. And this is the new kingdom. This is the new leader, the new ruler that they were talking about in David's Psalms. This is the new ruler that was dreamed about by Daniel when he saw the new kingdom and the new gate. This is the promise that Ezra and Nehemiah were working so hard to lead the people back, to pull them out of exile and to get them back to worshiping the one true Yahweh, who cared so much about them that he was compassionate and faithful for his people. And it's this theme that we see from start to finish of the Old Testament, from start of the New Testament really launched forward, that God is all about his kingdom and the advancement for his people. Yahweh loves his people and desires to have a kingdom of worshipers who desire to be in a relationship with him. So I hope that in this just quick summary of what the Old Testament is about, that you too can see that there is a centralized theme of kingdom and kingdom advancement in the Old Testament.